This revision screencast is going to give you a whistle-stop tour of the gender topic in A-level psychology. This is in the options paper, so paper 3, and I know that this is an area for my students where we covered it in term 6, so there was a lot of absence, and so I feel like I need to go over it all, but I haven't got time, and I'm going to give you a quick whistle-stop tour now, and hopefully this is going to re-jog your memory. For reference, here are the different topics in the gender unit, and I'm going to talk about each of them very, very briefly so that you get the general AO1 content. It's your job to do the AO3 content. So you need to look back through the resources that we've looked at, and you will be able to evaluate those using textbooks and paragraphs that we've written and points that we've discussed before. The first topic links into basically what is sex, what is gender, what are sexual stereotypes, what is androgyny. So sex is defined as being genetically male, so having an XY chromosome, or being genetically female, as in XX. Gender is a person's sense of maleness or femaleness. It's something that's socially constructed or psychologically constructed. And then we can also look at androgyny, which is what BEM researches. And androgyny comes from the two words andro, meaning male, and gyne, meaning female. And basically, androgyny is a gender which mixes both aspects of the female gender stereotype and the male gender stereotype together. And so what BEM did was use her test, which got participants to rate how they felt in relation to a selection of words that linked to their personality. So they might have had happy, loyal, feminine, masculine, dominant, conceited, and they had to rank all of those words from 1 to 7 in relation to how they thought, and then the score was produced, and she then found that we saw this increase in androgyny at the time where she was doing her research. In relation to chromosomes and hormones, you need to know about the roles of these three. So testosterone, we know, is present in fetuses, present before the baby's born, but the effect doesn't really fully come into play until they're in puberty, which is we see the development of facial hair and pubic hair, and then obviously as the baby is growing inside the mother's tummy, it is the XY chromosome that produces testosterone that develops the testes in men. We then have estrogen, which produces from periods the secondary sexual characteristics, so breast development, the development of the menstrual cycle. And then we have oxytocin, which is often called the love hormone, and it's this hormone that's thought to produce a bonding between men and women, which is produced in the pituitary gland. And it's important in breastfeeding. It causes milk to flow in a lactating mother, and also oxytocin plays an important role in stress in the fight or flight response. And it's thought that men and women have a different level of oxytocin because their response to fight or flight is different. In this section, we use the case of Dr. Money and the case study of Bruce and Brenda, where we had the young boy whose penis was burnt off in an accident at hospital, and so Dr. Money felt that the boy could be brought up as a girl. So we use this case study in relation to chromosomes and hormones because we saw as Brenda grew up, she wanted to be male despite having had different treatments and being brought up socially as a female, and it shows the role that chromosomes and hormones play in someone's gender development and gender identity. We then have to understand the role that chromosomes play in someone who's got atypical chromosomal development. We need to look at Turner's syndrome, which is produced from an XO configuration in relation to chromosomes. So that's when females are brought up with a XO configuration. An individual is born with a vagina, born with a womb, so they are characteristically female. However, there are some things that are attributed to perhaps they're a bit shorter than average. They might not have periods, and we also sometimes see a smaller lower jaw or webbed neck as some characteristics of someone with Turner syndrome. For Klinefelter syndrome, We see this in men who develop XXY configuration. So they develop as a fairly normal male, but they may have more feminine physical traits. So perhaps more development of breast tissue, broader hips, less facial hair, etc. In relation to gender schema theory, what is important here are the role that schemas play in our understanding of what it means to be male and what it means to be female. So gender schemas, or kind of what we might call stereotypes, play a big role in organising information in children, and maybe helps us to see what jobs people might fit into, or the toys that they play with and the clothes that they wear. And so they build up these schemas from being young, and they are linked to our cultural norms, and so that's how we develop what it means to be female and what it means to be male. And this becomes stronger and this develops because we have in-group behaviours that suit our in-group, so our gender, that we've understood that we are part of that gender, and then any out-group behaviour reinforces our in-group behaviour. So a child wants to avoid being associated with their out-group, so will change their behaviour to ensure that they go along with a stereotype for their in-group. And peer relationships play a huge role in this, because what it means, if you are teased for acting, girly or boy-y if you are the opposite gender, then that reinforces it due to the consequences of acting in such a way. And it's important to understand that this idea of schemas actually means that our gender identity and understanding of gender becomes quite fixed from an early age, and we have very set and resilient gender beliefs, and we can be quite strong in thinking that is not what boys do and that is not what girls do. So this is kind of going to be linked to Kohlberg's theory we see in a minute, but schema plays a huge role in our understanding of our gender identity. So Kohlberg's theory is another cognitive theory of gender development, which looks at 3 stages. Kohlberg uses some of the work of Piaget, so it's dealing with the stage theory. He identifies that at stage 1 you have gender labelling, which occurs between the age of 2 and 3, and at this point children label themselves as either boy or girl, or a male or female, and this is based on outward appearance only. So you can look at, that person's wearing this, so that makes them a boy, that person's wearing this and that makes them a girl. And this is linked to the stage by Piaget in the pre-operational stage. It's not internally something that's consistent, but outwardly it's something that we consider as consistent. The understanding of consistency changes though as we move into the gender stability stage, from around the age of 4, where children begin to recognise that gender is something that's consistent over time. They understand that boys go into men and girls go into women, so their concept of gender is stable, but it doesn't recognise a level of consistency yet, but it does understand that that is what happens to someone from being male as a young boy to growing into man later on. We then see the period of gender constancy develop around the age of 6, where children begin to realise that gender stays the same across different situations. So they understand that gender behaviour that gendered behaviour that matches their identity is important, but if somebody was wearing clothes that you would expect to see on a man, the child can still understand that that person is still female even though they are dressed as male, and that's where we begin to see more understanding of gender development happen. It's all about our thinking processes, which is why we attribute it to Kohlberg and the cognitive. Then of course we have everybody's favourite theories in the Oedipus complex and the Electra complex, and Freud states that gender development stems from you identifying with your same-sex role model after going through the Oedipus or Electra complex in the phallic stages. So the Oedipus complex is when you initially have feelings towards your mother, and go through a fear of castration anxiety because you're worried that your dad is going to want to cut off your penis, and what ends up happening is that you end up identifying with your dad and realising that you want to have a relationship with somebody like your dad has with your mum. A very similar thing happens in the Electra complex, where a girl goes through the period of penis envy and wanting to have that relationship with someone adult and realizes that instead of the penis envy, what they actually want is to have a baby, and that's how they then develop their gender identity. You need to look into the details of that. That's me giving a very quick summary, but Freud's theory tends to be one that sticks with people. We then move on to social learning theory, which is another one that people fully understand. We understand Bandura's concepts, we understand the idea of the theory. What we do need to know is the difference between indirect reinforcement and direct reinforcement. So with indirect reinforcement, there's certain behaviour that children will observe at school or at home that are not deliberately trying to force them into their gender, but it just happens to be that way. So they see that, women in primary school tend to perform a certain role, or the women in their household perform a certain role. Then there's also the role of direct reinforcement, when children respond and act up to the gender that they are, specifically, when they maybe do something big and strong and they said, oh, there's a good boy, and they're reinforced directly for that. And also it gets to the point where children are so immersed in this gendered culture that they begin to self-direct, and they don't need any form of reinforcement to do this. They just know how to act within that specific way. Media plays a big part in this, so we see role models in the media, which we look up to, and that helps our gender identity become more stable. And we see vicarious reinforcement within advertising or in TV shows that help us do this. Within culture, there's evidence to suggest that actually gender is something that's socially constructed, because in different cultures, Margaret Mead found in Papua New Guinea that there were different roles of men and women. So if it's actually something that is socially constructed, these ideas challenge what is found in the research in relation to sex and our chromosomes. And then we have the topic on atypical gender development, where we have biological explanations for gender dysphoria. And gender dysphoria is when your persistent feeling of identifying with the opposite gender to your biological sex. And we see in biological explanations, we have the idea that perhaps there's some kind of cross-wiring in the brain and phantom limb syndrome, so you always feel like you should have the opposite genitalia to the one that you have. Also, there's some form of transsexual gene, or that the brain in someone with gender dysphoria is neuro in terms of the neurotransmitters and the chemicals in the brain, it's neurologically different to someone who does not have gender dysphoria. And then there are lots of, particularly in relation to the psychodynamic approach, there are lots of psycho explanations for gender dysphoria, looking at the relationship between mothers and sons, and looking at the relationship between fathers and daughters, and also seeing that being brought up in a home which might develop mental illness, you can also use this as an explanation for gender development. And what's important to see here, if you have an essay on this, which it did come up last year, so hopefully it won't come up again, is that you need to provide a balance between the biological explanations and the socio explanations. And if it asks for, research into it, you do need to have the studies. So the studies that we look at really, that we have looked at is Zhu in relation to brain sex theory. We've also looked at research into Stoller for the mother-son relationships. In relation to the role that mental illness plays, we've looked at Coates. I think the thing that's frustrating in gender is you do not always have the key studies like you have in topics like social influence or memory or attachment. So what you need to do is go away and tell yourself which are the key studies that I'm going to focus on. For something like Freud, it's obvious that you use little hands, but in something in relation to atypical gender development, it is important that you find your studies that you're going to stick with and you understand. There's no point trying to regurgitate a study that you don't fully get. I hope that that's given you an overview of the topic, and you can see how all the ideas blend into one another. It's your job now to go away and provide evaluation points for those ideas, but overloading yourself with AO1 content at this stage isn't helpful. You need to get the basics down, you need to be able to reproduce them in the exam, but your focus should be on evaluation.